Hello and welcome to the UAF Outdoor Adventures Avalanche Awareness Clinic. My name is Frank Olive, and I've been playing in the mountains here in Alaska for the last 25 years. I want to bring this clinic to you specifically to give you a basic knowledge of some of the different types of avalanche. I want to help you recognize and know how to avoid avalanche terrain using planning tools ahead of time and route finding in the field. I'm hoping that you gain an understanding of what you don't know, and this will encourage you to seek out more training and education and experience within this avalanche world. I'm also hoping that to help you recognize some of the human factors that can affect our decision making in the field, to know how weather can contribute to some of the avalanche hazards, and to give you some local resources that are available to you and where to look for more training opportunities. During this presentation, I'm going to discuss the types of avalanche. The four major types I'm going to talk about are loose snow avalanches, slab avalanches, cornice or cornice falls, and ice fall avalanches. To start off with, loose snow avalanches are sometimes referred to also as point release avalanches. Generally have somewhat of a cone shape as they entrain more snow coming down. Skiers sometimes call these avalanches, these loose snow avalanches, slough, or skiing your own slough. Generally speaking, these aren't the most dangerous or hazardous avalanches to backcountry skiers, but in certain circumstances they definitely can be dangerous. One of those circumstances is if they're just big enough to knock you off your feet and carry you down the slope. This might carry you over a cliff or another hazard into rocks, something like that. Also, if you've got a terrain feature such as a gully that could entrain enough snow with this loose snow avalanche to bury a person. Those are a couple ways in which loose snow avalanches could be dangerous to folks. The main type of avalanche that I'm going to talk about today are slab avalanches. A slab avalanche is where a cohesive unit of snow breaks away as a unit and flows down the mountain. These are the type of avalanches that consistently get backcountry travelers into trouble. When talking about slab avalanches have different parts to them or components that make them happen or describe them. So to start with, the top of a slab avalanche is called the crown or the crown face. The sides are called the flanks, and generally the crown could be referred to as the fracture line as well. The avalanche itself, the slab slides on a bed surface. It's typically initiated or caused by the weak layer not being strong enough to hold the slab and any additional weight. As it goes, it slides on that bed surface and creates a debris problem at the bottom of the slide. When discussing slab avalanches, it's also important to realize that there are many different types of slabs. It doesn't have to be a rock-hard block of snow that you can easily pick up and hold to be a slab, although sometimes it is. So there are soft slabs and hard slabs, wind slabs, and there's also wet snow slabs as well, and they all have different characteristics, but the thing they have in common is that the snow is cohesive enough to break as a unit. Another type of avalanche that is important for us as backcountry travelers to recognize is a cornice collapse or a cornice avalanche. These tend to be a little bit more random when they happen, and so being aware that cornices can cause problems is important for backcountry travelers. And generally with cornices, our strategy is avoidance. The other thing about cornices is many times below a cornice you can have a wind pillow or a wind slab form below a cornice. We know cornices are formed by wind bringing snow out over the edge, so it's an overhanging unit of snow. These units of snow, when they break away, can break away like a Mack truck hitting a hillside, and we know that generally speaking there's extra snow that's been put on that particular slope right below that cornice. And so that setup makes it so that if a cornice collapses, not only are the big chunks dangerous coming down the hill, but it's very possible that it could propagate a large slab avalanche based on that force on that hillside. The last type of avalanche I'll talk about are called ice falls, and these come in the form of like a large ice fall on a glacier or a smaller ice fall known as a hanging glacier. The danger with these is ice chunks from small to extremely large breaking off randomly and coming down and hitting people who are traveling in the backcountry. Our best strategy for ice falls are either if we're feeling confident traveling very quickly through that terrain beneath an ice fall, or choosing to avoid it altogether. There are giant ice falls where a chunk of ice might come out onto a glacier or a slope below, might travel a mile out onto that surface. So we really have to be aware of these. These also are very difficult to forecast or predict. They're pretty random in terms of when they release. So generally speaking, avoiding is the best option. Now that we've talked a little bit about the different types of avalanche, I'm going to narrow it down back to slab avalanches. And in their book, Snow Sense, Jill Fredston and Doug Fessler have come up with a system that helps us talk about the different components of slab avalanches. Right at the bottom at the base is terrain, and terrain's a very important tool and a very important thing to know about when we're talking about avalanches. We also have the weather factors with an avalanche, and we have the snowpack factors with an avalanche. But it's also important to note that we've got the people, and the people being us, we're in the middle of that avalanche. If we take away people and property from a situation in the mountains, there really is no hazard because we bring the hazard with us when we go into the mountains. And this format's going to help us break it down. I'll first talk about terrain factors, and then I'll talk about weather factors, and then I'll talk about snowpack factors as we go through. Some of the main terrain factors that we talk about are going to be the slope angle, and this is really one of the big keys that we'll talk about here. Slope aspect, which direction it is, terrain anchoring, slope shape, and then terrain traps or the consequences of an avalanche based on the shape of the terrain. So slope angle is a huge part of how we define avalanche terrain, how we know we can avoid avalanche terrain, and slope angle is how steep the slope is that the snow is sitting upon. Generally speaking, 25 to 60 degrees is what is broadly termed as avalanche terrain, but more specifically 30 to 45 degrees is really what we're worried about and concerned about for slab avalanches for the most part. Generally speaking, steeper than about 45 degrees, the gravity is too much for those slopes to hold much snow and release in a large dangerous slab type avalanche. And less than 25 or 30 degrees, the snow doesn't have enough, there's not enough force of gravity to cause a slab avalanche. So really we're looking at that typically 30 to 45 degrees as our main kind of avalanche terrain, and even more specifically, somewhere in like that 37, 38 degree slope angle seems to be the peak of slab avalanche as far as when we're looking at terrain. It's important to note here that it's not necessarily just the angle of the slope you're standing on, but it's also the angle of the slope that you're connected to, because a 40-degree slope up above you could easily trigger, remote trigger, naturally avalanche, and come down onto the 10-degree slope that you're currently standing on. So it's not only the angle of the slope, but also the angle of the slope that you're connected to. So as we know that the basic avalanche terrain guidelines are about 30 degrees to about 45 degrees, we can use some tools planning ahead of time before we go out in the field. And we can check using this awesome program from CalTopo, which is a shaded relief map. And this relief map corresponds colors to the steepness of the slope. And it's a great way to get a general picture for whether you're traveling through avalanche terrain or not. The limitation of this is really based on the data that the topo map has. And most of the data in Alaska is pretty poor. We're doing 100-foot contours, so it's very easy to get into smaller terrain features that are not shaded red, but that still might be in that prime time 40-degree steepness of slope. So this tool isn't necessarily awesome for route finding in the field. Working through terrain and micro terrain in the field really requires more of a hands-on approach to figuring out angles and whether you're in avalanche terrain or not. But this is good for some of the big picture planning ahead of time that you can do from home. And as we can see in this picture, slope angle is one of the keys. You can see that the people ran all over this slope with snow machines until one hit just the right angle, just the right spot to trigger an avalanche in this location. Another factor, terrain factor that we're worried about is slope aspect. And many times we're referring to slope aspect based on leeward or windward slopes. You can see in this photo, the right side of this ridge line is the windward slope. So the winds came and pulled all the snow off of that windward slope and deposited it onto the leeward slope. Generally speaking, the windward slope has less stress and becomes more stable, and the leeward slope has more stress and it becomes less stable as the additional weight of that snow gets added to the snowpack that's there. Another aspect-related terrain feature is exposure to the sun. Here in Alaska, and especially in the eastern Alaska range, the sun really starts to work well, has a good angle once we get into March. And so generally speaking, those south-facing slopes in the eastern Alaska range get more stable by having that sun and warmth hit them and generally speaking can resolve some of the instabilities that occur throughout the cold, dark winter months. But by the time we get into April, there's too much sun, and the sun can actually weaken the bonds, create wet slab avalanches and things like that on those south-facing slopes. And so we generally move to the north-facing slopes, which are just then getting that warmth and sunshine in April to resolve some of those deep instabilities. And so that's one way that the sun could affect the stability of a certain area or certain slopes. And in addition to aspect, another variable that we need to deal with is elevation. You can see here in this little diagram that the stability rating for the different elevations changes as well as the aspect. So we've got a high north-facing slope that might have a higher risk of avalanche than a low down one with a different aspect. So elevation is also important to consider. If we're doing any sort of snow assessment or whatever at 2,000 feet and we climb up to 8,000 feet, the snowpack is going to have changed, and we're going to need to consider what's happening at that elevation. Another feature another thing we're considering with terrain is the shape of the terrain and trigger zones. So the shape of the terrain refers to the shape of the slope. We have convex rollovers as a common term for skiers and mountain travelers. And convex rollovers is when you go from fairly flat terrain to steeper terrain. There's additional stresses on the snowpack or the slab at those convex rollovers. And in some places you would even have some compressive support if there were some concavities in the snow as you transition out onto the flats. But basically what we're more worried about is having a specific trigger point or stress zone there at convex rollovers. And in addition to that, we've got features that help form certain snow types and whatnot which could propagate a slab avalanche. Things like beneath the cornice, which I mentioned earlier, there could be wind pillow or additional snow. Rock outcroppings, trees, bushes, things like that can change the characteristics of the crystals of the snow and be more it more realistically could be zones which would trigger avalanches. So we've talked about different terrain features, but one of the things that's really important to realize about terrain is that we can use terrain to help mitigate our avalanche risk, and we can also use it to stay out of avalanche terrain altogether. If we're on a ridge top, sometimes that can provide terrain that's safe from avalanches. Now in this picture you can see, we may not have a high avalanche risk or a risk of slab avalanches, but there are other risks involved in certain terrain features. This picture is really one of the big takeaways from this whole presentation, and that is finding terrain that you can minimize your avalanche risk. And so, like I mentioned in the previous slide, we've got the ridgetop that are generally safe because you don't have snow that's above you. But we've got some other spots which are, people sometimes get confused about. When you have open forests and glades, people think, oh, all those trees are anchoring the snow. But really, if you can ski down through those open glades, open forest, the snow can flow down through them. And so the trees actually add to your hazard, because if you did get caught in an avalanche, the consequence is very high that you're going to get raked through trees or get bashed against trees while you're in that avalanche. Basically, the time when anchoring does happen with trees is when they're so dense you can't comfortably ski down through them. And sometimes in that situation, the trees can provide some anchoring. Obviously, the steep slope is potentially unsafe, as far as has the potential for avalanche. But the other thing is what I mentioned earlier as well, is that 10-degree slope below that steep slope. It also potentially has some hazard. But when you're far enough away from those slopes out in the middle of the valley, that can provide us with safe travel terrain from avalanches. One of the ways that we think about or determine what is safe out in a valley is called the runout angle. And so basically it's a measured angle that we shoot from where we're standing to the highest point at which an avalanche crown could begin or an avalanche could fracture. And we want to measure that angle and keep it at about 19 degrees or less. There have been situations where they've run a little further than that, avalanches, but generally speaking, 19 degrees is a good rule of thumb for determining if we're in the potential path for an avalanche. So as we begin to think about avalanche terrain, we've defined it, we've said where it is. Now we have to think about, okay, so we come to avalanche terrain and we need to overcome some of our human flaws in terms of decision making. And one of the tools that can be very helpful is the STOP acronym. And basically this allows us to take a timeout and formulate and communicate a plan before we enter avalanche terrain. So this is great when you've been skiing up, you're not in avalanche terrain, and you're basically moving forward means getting into avalanche terrain. You can use this acronym to help you make good decisions. So stopping is physically stopping the group, getting the group together, thinking about the different factors and the information that you have. Sharing observations, making sure everyone knows they've heard woofing here, they've seen natural avalanches over there, they have information from last weekend, they cut a skin track, whatever that might be, sharing that information in the group, and then coming up with a cohesive plan if you do come to the decision to travel into the avalanche terrain, and also using this idea of pre-mortem. Pre-mortem means thinking about what would happen if there was an avalanche, and this could be discussing consequences, but it could also be from the perspective of a newspaper report about what someone might say if there was an accident in that situation. And sometimes that can help frame the question in a way where you can make a good decision about whether to enter avalanche terrain or not. So the last thing as far as terrain goes that I'm going to talk about are terrain traps. So these are areas where the consequence of having an avalanche are extremely can be extremely large. And so these would be things like a gully, where even a small avalanche might bury you 8 feet deep, whereas if it was a run-out type slope with a good run-out, you might not get buried at all in that small avalanche that's possible that day. Another one is being swept over a cliff or having terrain above you that might get remote triggered and come down and hit you. Those are all things that we view as terrain traps, and really thinking about the consequences of what that means when you're out. So coming down to some of the red light terrain features are going to be slope angles that are 25 to 60 degrees, but realistically, more specifically, 30 to 45 degrees. Another one would be various terrain traps that increase the consequence of any slide. And then also some of our red light terrain features would be aspects that have become wind loaded or have been exposed to a large amount of sun or very, very little sun, depending on how the snowpack works throughout the winter. The next aspect, or the next leg of the triangle that I'm going to talk about, is the snowpack. Could the snow slide? That's really the question. Is there a strong cohesive slab sitting on top of a weak layer, sitting on top of some sort of a bed surface which could slide in? That's kind of the setup for a potential slab avalanche. And so we're going to look at the snow and the snowpack to see if we can figure out if this setup for a slab avalanche exists. One of the keys when we're looking at a snowpack is that we want to watch for signs of instability, not signs of stability. Snowpacks are, generally speaking, 95% of the time are stable. So it's that 5% of the time where we're looking for that instability. And when we find that, that gives us the clues we need to make decisions about avalanche terrain. Looking for stability, we're going to find stability much of the time. So I think it's an important concept to think about, maybe not saying, oh, we're looking for this stable snow. Really what we're looking for when we do stability tests, observations, skin track cutting, hand pits, all the different things we're doing, we're really looking for instabilities and using that to help us make decisions. One of the ways that we make decisions about snowpack is that we look at it and we classify the layers in the snowpack. We classify it in terms of hardness, we classify it in terms of crystal type, things like that, cohesiveness with the other layers. This is a helpful way to think about the snowpack, and sometimes we can even identify certain dates within the snowpack based on some of the weather that has happened throughout the year. When we do look at the snowpack, one of the things we're looking for specifically a lot of times is weak layers. And a weak layer is, generally speaking, a layer that contains snow crystals that are not cohesive with each other. They basically are easy to tip over, easy to slide upon each other, faceted snow crystals, and they come in lots of different forms. One of the types of faceted crystals that we encounter is called surface hoar. So these are feather-like faceted crystals that form on the surface of the snow. Sometimes they're called near surface facet, sometimes they're surface hoar. There's definitely a lot of technical snow terms, but basically these feathery crystals are not a big deal. They tinkle when you touch them. When you look at them, they're very angular under a glass. But the problem with these is if a big heavy snowfall falls on top of these crystals, many times they impede the snow's ability to bond the snow that was previously there, and they act as the weak layer which allows that slab to potentially slide upon. Another thought is these are like little champagne glasses, and you stick a 2x or a piece of plywood on top of it. You could stand on that, but if you get the right forces, the whole thing will tip over and all those champagne glasses will tip over and the board will slide off. So that's kind of one of the ideas with surface. Another weak layer which we're especially concerned about, especially with the thin snowpack in like the eastern Alaska range, is going to be depth hoar. And this is faceted crystals that form near the bottom of the snowpack. When you have a thin snowpack and a big temperature difference between the air and the ground, these tend to form at ground level and can create a weak layer, which can lead to large and very dangerous avalanches, because basically the entire snowpack down to the ground can slide. And so the depth hoar is something that we have to be really careful of with our continental snowpack in the eastern Alaska range. So strong layers are another thing we're looking at, and this is how we determine if there's a cohesive slab. So strong layers are well bonded, cohesive slabs of snow, and they can be soft. They don't necessarily have to be rock hard, but they have to be cohesive and will break and move as a unit. So this would include, a nice metamorphized rounds. This would include wind slab. This would include a new storm slab that's bonded well together. All of those things are strong layers. It's really important to not confuse the term strong with stable. Strong means that there's a cohesive slab that could slide as a unit. Stable means that the snowpack in general is bonded all together, even if there's differentiated layers, that they're stably bonded together. So if you have a strong layer sitting on top of a weak layer, that's actually a setup for a slab avalanche potentially. So this is a picture of a wind slab breaking away. So this wind slab that was formed by snowflakes getting rolled around the ground, getting their arms and legs broken off and packed together, formed on top of some layer that was weak enough and some layer that was a good enough bed surface where it could break away as a unit and slide down the hill. So you can see in these pictures an unstable snow structure existing where you've got a slab with a weak layer and a bed layer, things like that. And sometimes I like to think of it as an upside down wedding cake. And a good example of a practical unstable snow structure in the field, or a couple of them. One would be if surface hoar exists and you get a nice big snowstorm on top of that. That might be a good setup for an unstable snow structure. Another unstable snow structure might be when a storm comes in cold and dry and then finishes with a bunch of heavy, wet, warm snow on top of that. That potentially wouldn't bond well together and could form a setup for an unstable snow structure, like an upside down wedding cake with the different layers and the biggest layers on top and the little teeny layers on the bottom. It's easy for that to collapse. So some of the red light clues to instability are going to be if you witness a natural avalanche. That's like the reddest light that you can get. If you observe recent avalanche activity on similar slopes, similar aspects to what you're thinking about traveling on, again, very obvious clue that there's instability exists. Woofing noises, where the snowpack collapses on a weak layer, shooting cracks, which show propagation tendency and energy in that snowpack in a specific layer, hollow sounding snow from maybe a wind slab event, instabilities indicated in a pit test. So there are pit tests that we do with the snowpack to sort of see what instabilities exist and how sensitive they are. We also have, when a small test slope slides, so maybe you stomp on a little 5-foot high roller or something that is not going to engulf you if it does avalanche, and it slides, and on that layer it slides on. Hand pit instability, skin track cutting. There's lots of different ways that we can have these bullseye clues to instability when we're out. So the next leg of the triangle, the next thing we're considering is weather contributing to the instability of the snowpack. What is weather doing? And with weather, we'll discuss rain and snow, we'll talk about wind, and we'll talk about temperature. So the different types of weather, precipitation is one of the important ones. So precipitation generally in this refers to snow, and so snow adds weight to the snowpack, which adds stress. Snow does come with bonds as well. The faster the snow falls, the more weight is put on in less time, the less easily a snowpack adjusts to that new weight. So 2 feet of snow over 2 weeks affects the snowpack differently than 2 feet of snow in 12 hours or in one day. Will definitely affect the snowpack's ability to adjust to that new weight. One of the forms of precipitation, which is especially hard for the snowpack to adjust to, is rain, because rain adds a lot of weight in terms of the water weight without adding any bonds to the snowpack. And so rain is really a trigger for natural avalanches and instabilities. The other thing to realize about snow is it's not how deep the snow is, it's how much the snow weighs. And so when we talk about snow and how much snow there is, generally we talk about its weight in water. How many millimeters of water equivalency is in the snow that's fallen. Wind loading is another huge factor for avalanches. The wind can transport snow very quickly. So new snow that's fallen, wind can transport snow 10 times faster than it can fall out of the sky. So you can get changes in stability and in the snowpack very quickly happening. And also the wind generally creates more of a slab or a strong snow setup in the sense of the wind slab that happens when the snow gets transported by the wind. And so it's very important to think about. As you think about wind, one thing is, like I mentioned before, the windward slopes in theory could become more stable because the snow is getting pulled off of there, the weight is getting pulled off, but it's getting put somewhere, and it's getting put onto the leeward slopes, and those slopes will become less stable. And this is something that can happen even within the same day or within the same weekend or whatever, that the stability can change based on what the wind is doing with the snow. So it's something we need to consider while we're out in the field, as well as consider what's been happening before we got out in the field. The next thing is temperature contributing to instability? And the big things we want to watch for here are prolonged very cold temperatures, which can create faceted snow, whether that's depth hoar or surface hoar, things like that, near surface faceting, or a lot of warm temperatures, and this could be a lot of exposure to sun, where we might have wet slab avalanches, things like that, or even just dramatic temperature changes from -30 to +30 in a very short amount of time can affect the stability on slopes and within the snowpack. So our red light weather considerations are going to be things like heavy dense snowfall or rain are going to be things that we need to think about. 12 inches of snow or more in a short amount of time. New snowfall greater than about 1 inch per hour. Wind loading starts about 10 miles per hour, but really revs up between about 15 to 20 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour. We need to consider what's happening. Long, cold, clear spells followed by significant snowfalls where the surface facets might have happened and then snow fell on top of it. Storms that start cold and end warm. Rapidly rising temperatures, which I mentioned as well. Prolonged periods of above freezing temperatures can have a big effect on some of that with the weather, and intense sun, especially near cliff bands. So those are all our red light weather clues that we want to perk up if we see any of those things happening, either when we're in the field or when we're observing before we go into the field. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the big factors we bring with us into the field is we are people, so we're fallible. And so we need help making decisions. This is a decision-making matrix that uses a similar concepts that we've talked about: red light, green light, terrain, snowpack, weather, human factor. But basically, some of the points to take away here is that if you're a green light terrain, you're pretty much always green light decision, because you're not basically making green light terrain means you're not in avalanche terrain. So this is how a lot of people mitigate their risk, is when they aren't sure of what's happening, or they don't want to have avalanche hazard that particular day. They choose terrain that keeps them out of avalanche terrain, or even out of avalanche terrain to slowly work yourself into low consequence avalanche terrain. It's a tool that we'll use. But again, this chart is just a tool for helping us make good decisions. In many parts of the world, we've got avalanche forecasting, and by and large, a lot of the avalanche forecasters use a certain way to talk about avalanches that will help us. Unfortunately, in a lot of the Alaska Range, Eastern Alaska Range, we don't have avalanche forecasting, but we can still use this same process. So basically, there's 4 questions that are asked. What type of problem? Examples would be a storm slab, so it recently just snowed a bunch. Wind slab, we got snow and then the wind really kicked up and blew the snow around. Buried surface ore, this is something that we can go out and observe in the field, or we've observed previously in the field. Depth ore, which once it's formed tends to take a long time to resolve and sometimes is a season-long problem, or persistent buried weak layer, and this is a really insidious one that doesn't show up all the time, shows up kind of at different depths based on how deep the snow is, and can be difficult to deal with in the field. But those are all examples. So you might read an avalanche report with more than one of these problems, but sort of listed what the problem is. And then the other thing is where the problem is. So an example of this might be leeward slopes, north-facing leeward slopes might be an example of where a problem is. And this means that the snow has been blown onto those north-facing slopes and they've formed, there's a wind slab that's formed on those north-facing slopes, leeward slopes. How likely? So this is what the snowpack looks like. How likely is it that there's going to be an avalanche? And then it's also important to note how big is that avalanche going to be, because that really affects like the hazard to us as people. Sometimes they're very big too, and there's sort of a range in that, how big is it's going to be. But this is a structure people use to talk about avalanches when they're putting out information. So ideally, this is the easily accessible information like this exists for everywhere we go. It includes at the bottom a professional avalanche bulletin based on the different elevations, and you've got the 5-tiered system: low, moderate, considerable, high, and extreme, and that gives us a good feel for what's happening out there. In addition, you've got information about how much snow has fallen. You've got information about the wind and the gust speed. You've got information about the high and low temperatures. And this allows us to really track things and to make some good decisions before we go out into the field. Unfortunately, for areas like the Eastern Alaska Range, we need to come up with this information ourselves. And so this is just an example of a weather log, and it shows high-low temperatures. It shows where there was precip, the water equivalent, again, which is important based on how much weight was added, shows wind speeds, wind directions, and gusts. And it just is something that allows a person from home, if you're not out there every day, to sort of track what's been happening down there. And sometimes something like this, you can even pinpoint dates within the snowpack. A melt freeze event, a huge wind event, or a big snowfall. You can find those layers in the snowpack when you go down to the mountains. But it helps you have a hypothesis before you go down to them. So I've already mentioned that we don't have professional avalanche forecasting for somewhere like the Alaska Range or the Eastern Alaska Range. We do have some resources. So some of the resources that we have for these areas are, we have the Eastern Alaska Range Avalanche Center website, and they also have a Facebook page, and people post observations there, and the observations are super helpful and useful, so you should consider posting your own observations if you go there. But the idea is that we're sharing information that we have. observe natural avalanches, wind layers, snow events, things that you've seen out there. It doesn't have to be formatted in professional avalanche jargon. You can basically just talk about what you saw, give people some information and feel for what's happening down there. This is great if you can, use this resource. Also, word of mouth. If you've got friends who've been down there, I'm always asking people, oh, how was it? Did you see any avalanche signs? What did the snowpack look like? I'm always prying people who I encounter who've been down to the mountains more recently than me about what they saw, and kind of just to garner any information I can. And then occasionally there'll be something like a professional avalanche course in the area, or there'll be professional forecasting for something like the Arctic Man ski and snow machine race down there in April. Things like that. If you can find those professional resources occasionally, they're helpful as well. So one of the big questions is, what gets people in trouble in the backcountry? These are three of the things that many times are a part of people getting themselves into trouble in the backcountry. Missed obvious clues. So this is not taking into account that the natural avalanches that you've observed on similar aspects and similar elevations that you're thinking about traveling on probably mean that there's a high probability of the slope that you want to travel on avalanching. Poor communication is a big one as well that leads to trouble in the backcountry. So this is not telling people what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what your tolerance for risk is, communicating effectively in the field, and having some sort of a system like the STOP acronym or something else that you can rely on to communicate effectively in the field. And poor travel techniques. And travel techniques within the backcountry, there's another talk on this UAF media page about rescue techniques and travel techniques, but basically having two people on a slope in avalanche terrain at the same time would be an example of poor travel techniques that can get people in trouble in the backcountry. So as we get further along and we've gotten through the terrain and the weather and the snowpack, now we need to come down to us as humans, and this is a pretty important part of figuring out what's happening in the backcountry, because we are really good at tricking ourselves and making mistakes because we're human. So our attitude going out, our ego, poor planning, tunnel vision, indecision, poor communication, summit fever, being tired, all these things can contribute to avalanche accidents in the field. And so one of the tools that I found especially useful in not having my human factors come into play is called strategic mindset. One of the big keys to strategic mindset is to know yourself. Know which things in you are likely to affect your decision making in the field. And so this is, if you know that you like to hurry, you're impatient, you might realize that about yourself. When you find yourself becoming impatient, you can curb that propensity by being aware of it. Another one is to expand your selection of desires. A lot of skiers or snowboarders or snow machiners, every time they go out, they want bluebird skies and to go on the biggest, steepest, gnarly powder runs that they could find, and that's really all they want. And so coming up with other desires that and then adjusting your desires to fit the conditions and the circumstances. If you're going out with 8 new skiers and they don't really know very much, you adjusting your desires that you're not going to go ski those big, steep, gnarly lines. You're going to take it back a notch and maybe not even enter avalanche terrain with that large group of inexperienced people, changing that desires to fit the conditions. And within this idea of a strategic mindset, there are several things that people have come up with. So these are some different states of mind that if you go out into the field with this state of mind, it can really help you not have to constantly overcome your human nature desire to go do what doesn't make sense on that particular day. So the one that I utilize the most in the Eastern Alaska Range is assessment. I go out there with the mindset of I don't really know what's happening, so I don't just jump right into avalanche terrain. I definitely spend a bunch of time exploring, assessing the snowpack, feeling things out, and maybe slowly working myself into avalanche terrain if that happens. Another mindset you could go out with is, let's say you've been out the last 3 weekends in a row, or the last bit, and you haven't found any signs of instability. There's been no major weather changes to change the snowpack. You might be stepping out. That might be taking you and deciding to get out onto that steeper slope and ski that steeper line that you've been looking at. If things seems to work. Status quo means nothing has changed, so nothing has changed. So if you went out and you had certain aspects you couldn't get on last week because of an instability there, and the weather hasn't changed, then you still can't get on those certain slopes that might have those deep, persistent instabilities because that hasn't changed. So that would be status quo. Stepping back would be, let's say you've gained confidence, you're stepping out, and then you do maybe on a little different aspect or a little different slope, you do another pit profile, and you get a dramatic pit instability. One of your stability tests shows a fairly dramatic change or something you didn't expect. That might be a time when you'd step back towards the assessment and try to figure out what's happening. Entrenchment means nothing has changed for a long time, and as much as you want it to, that deep persistent instability isn't going away anytime soon. Nothing has changed, so you need to just have that mindset of it's the same as it was, it's going to be the same until something major changes. And then open season, which doesn't come around very often, especially for me in somewhere like the Eastern Alaska Range, which means that's the day, that's the time. You've gained so much confidence and you have so little doubt in your assessment of how things are based on a lot of time and experience in that area that you are going to go jump on that steep couloir you've been wanting to ski for years or whatever it might be. So keeping in mind the human factors is super important, and it's important to realize and come up with strategies to help mitigate that. Some people will do meetings in the morning and the evening, sometimes called AM and PM meetings, where the group will sit down and communicate about what they know and all the different things. And sometimes there's even forums that help people make those decisions. But as far as this stuff goes, I hope this has helped you realize that further education will be really helpful. This is kind of an avalanche awareness type level. Most people who travel in the backcountry regularly should do a multi-day avalanche education course like AVI Rec 1 course. And that's kind of the minimum that I think most people should have traveling in the backcountry, and that'll include some snow stability stuff, talk about the human factors, talk about the weather in more detail, the things we've talked about, but actually go out in the field and do some hands-on route finding through terrain to mitigate the avalanche hazard. And it also will concentrate on some of the rescue techniques and equipment that you need to be safe out there. So it's great to know that there's always more to learn, always more to take in with avalanche safety. Thank you for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed this Avalanche Awareness Clinic.